This week on Christian World News, welcoming the stranger. U.S. churches are stepping up to serve refugees. See how they're helping these Afghans rebuild their lives in America. Plus, as we look ahead to Thanksgiving, we remember America's first settlers. See how the Pilgrims introduced the principles of liberty that shaped this great nation. And we go back in time to that very first Thanksgiving. What was the miracle that made it possible? Meet the slave turned hero who saved the Pilgrims of Plymouth Rock. Welcome to Christian World News, everyone. I'm Wendy Griffith. Well, some 50,000 Afghan refugees are in the process of resettling in America. So who will help them navigate the challenges of starting over in a foreign land? In many places, local churches will be among the very first to welcome them. CBN News National Affairs correspondent Heather Sells brings us the story from Fort Worth, Texas.
I'm not a very good
Refugees have been learning to speak English at Southcliff Baptist for 20 years. Early on, Bosnians learned a new language. Many of today's students come from a different war-torn land. Texas is preparing to receive more than 4,000 refugees from Afghanistan, and churches here have become part of the front lines in welcoming them.
Southcliff has always been there for the refugees.
Helmond Wardock and his family arrived 6 years ago. They're thriving in large part due to Southcliff. In addition to English classes, the church provides community and a safety net for those struggling to survive. After a 6-month honeymoon, their government housing and food allowance runs out.
What happens after is like the refugees mostly they are left by their own. So that's where the churches such as Southcliff, they come into action.
Across North Texas, hundreds of church volunteers have signed up and trained to help resettle those who fled Afghanistan. Northwood Church is sponsoring 3 families.
We're actually going to acquire 3 apartments and put those families up for 12 months.
April Hale volunteered to organize clothing needs after following Afghanistan on the news.
I found myself at home watching everything unfold, feeling helpless, and just wishing that I could find something to do to help them. When I found out that we were going to be able to help some families through our church, there it is. You know, that's my answer.
Her attitude may mark a shift in evangelical thinking towards refugees. During the Trump administration, the U.S. slashed the numbers allowed in to 15,000. That forced some faith-based agencies like World Relief to lay off staff and close offices. A 2018 Pew poll showing declining support for refugees among white evangelicals led many to wonder if the church was losing its vision for ministry. Now, the Biden administration plans to admit more refugees, and resettlement agencies are ramping back up. They're rehiring, recruiting volunteers, and stocking supplies. Next year, World Relief in North Texas will help resettle 4 times the number it did last year.
We are quickly expanding our offices, our staff.
Northwood pastor and World Relief partner Bob Roberts says he's seen an overwhelming response.
I think there's a shift that's taking place. We're coming back to who we are.
What's helped? A host of Christians with ties to ministries in Afghanistan, plus veterans.
The right response is we've been in the war. We have marginalized people to use them in the war in good conscience. We can't walk away from those people. That's not American.
Southcliff pastor Stu Kokenauer says refugees have changed his church.
We have persecuted Christians in this church that are just so grateful to be in a nation where they can worship Jesus without fear of the army busting in.
And churches are changing lives. Zahir, a former U.S. interpreter, fled Afghanistan in August with his wife and son.
Agency, they're providing, everything. Like they provide, like in the first, from the first day till now.
A church member co-signed for his apartment, and he's now looking for a job, any job. Wardock, meanwhile, is trying to help his 20 family members who worked with the U.S. government but can't get out of the country.
So we are just trying to talk to them, speak to them every day, just to calm them down.
As these refugees rebuild their lives here and try to help loved ones back home, they face plenty of risk and unknowns. One certainty, however, is the growing number of churches committed to helping them navigate a new culture while pointing them to the love of Christ. Reporting in North Texas, Heather Sells, CBN News.
Thank God for the church. Thanks, Heather. Well, coming up, with Thanksgiving just around the corner, we visit America's first settlers to see how their beliefs shaped this nation. As Americans enter Thanksgiving week, we remember the Pilgrims, the first settlers who came to this country seeking religious freedom. Their covenant and form of self-rule shaped America's Constitution and entire government. And as Paul Strand reports, they believed liberty was worth dying for.
Christian historian Jerry Newcomb's documentary, The Pilgrims, looks at how those 51 pilgrims not only survived their first Massachusetts winter, but went on to influence their future nation.
This small group casts a very large shadow.
From the documentary.
Did you know that today 10% of the population of the United States are Mayflower descendants? 30 million people from 51.
The Pilgrims founded America for all intents and purposes.
In those days, England demanded all citizens belong to the Church of England and conform to its beliefs or face harsh punishment.
You will worship as they say you worship. And so to do this illegally meant you could be arrested.
Or even put to death. So the Pilgrims fled.
They just wanted to worship Jesus in the purity of the gospel, and the king wouldn't let them do that. He was ruling it over their conscience. And that's why they fled.
They'd come to believe in radical ideas they found in the Bible, like they had rights given by God, and that he wanted them to be free, to govern themselves from within.
The Mayflower was a cargo ship, but the most precious cargo that was carried across the Atlantic were the ideas in the hearts of the Pilgrims that were drawn from the Bible.
And after unexpected winds blew them off course away from any governing authority, they made a covenant between God and man for a new form of government.
The Pilgrims gave us the Mayflower Compact, which was an agreement for self-government under God, which was really the first step in the creation, ultimately, of the Declaration of Independence and of the U.S. Constitution.
It was a polarity change in world government. Instead of top-down, ruled by these kings that keep getting more and more powerful, it's bottom-up. It's the people themselves deciding what laws they're going to pass and agreeing to submit to them.
It made freedom the cornerstone of America, as shown by the words on the Liberty Bell.
It says, proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof.
Some students are wrongly taught the Pilgrims stole from the Indians and treated them horribly. The record shows the opposite was true.
The Pilgrims were kind to the Indians. They showed them love. They showed them compassion. They showed them the godly way to live.
They did take some buried corn in cold New England, but only because they were literally starving.
And they even said, when they later came into contact with the Native Americans, they said, find out whose corn that is so we may repay them.
They didn't steal land in Plymouth. It had been abandoned by the Indians.
There was a plague that occurred 3 years before the voyage of the Mayflower, and it wiped out about 95% of the Indians in that particular region.
They wouldn't come back on it because of the plague. The Pilgrims took land nobody wanted.
And they showed the Indians they'd treat them as equals.
There was even a situation where a Pilgrim killed an Indian. The Pilgrim was put on trial.
The Indians expected
a mock trial, go through the motions, get it over with, let them go. After all they did was kill an Indian.
And that's not what happened. They found the Pilgrim guilty, and he was hanged for murder.
Everybody was equal under the law. Now the Indians could trust the Pilgrims.
The Pilgrims showed future Americans a God-blessed cause was something worth suffering for, even dying for. The Mayflower's Captain Jones offered to rescue them from the first deadly winter they faced.
Half their members have died. This is not what they signed up for at all. And Jones says, anybody who wants to come back to England with me, I will take them. Not one of them went.
The Pilgrims made living by the Bible and loving it a very American habit.
And their textbook was the Bible.
The Bible was the key book for the first 200 years.
The Founding Fathers brought America an enlightened revolution.
And above all, they quoted the Bible, 4 times more than they quoted any human author.
It gave them the go-ahead to throw off Britain's ungodly tyranny.
They recognize that there is a higher law, the law of God, and that God presides over the affairs of nations.
You are to obey the lawful authorities, but if the lawful authorities take too much authority unto themselves and they violate God's laws, then obedience to God means resistance to tyrants.
So the Pilgrims who'd fled England for their freedom laid the foundations that shaped America and eventually its freedom. Paul Strand, CBN News, Washington.
Thanks, Paul. Up next, the Thanksgiving hero kidnapped from his home and sold into slavery. Who was this man named Squanto? And why would there be no Thanksgiving without him? When the Pilgrims arrived in America, they faced harsh conditions. The winter of 1620 was so brutal that half of them didn't survive. Those who did nearly perished from a lack of food. What turned their situation around? The help of a Native American named Squanto. Here's his story.
Thy help cometh from the Lord, who keepeth Israel. The Lord of Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. He shall become thy shade upon thy right hand. He shall protect thy incomings and outgoings.
In the winter of 1620, the Pilgrims at Plymouth are struggling to survive. The long journey to America has taken a heavy toll on the weary travelers. They were not equipped to deal with the many challenges in the New World, and nearly half perished in the early days of their journey. In the midst of their struggle, they humbled themselves and turned their hearts to God, praying for His mercy and providence to protect them and establish their community.
Dear Lord, find us in the wilderness.
Their prayers would be answered through a series of divine and tragic events that occurred years earlier in the life of a young native boy named Tisquantum. It was the early 1600s in the area that would soon be called Massachusetts. Tisquantum and his tribe were curious about the men from across the ocean who would visit their shoreline from time to time. During one of those visits, an English sailor, Thomas Hunt, not satisfied with his income and looking for dishonest gain, came to the region looking for opportunities. Hunt broke trust with the tribes and took Tisquantum and 23 other natives aboard his ship. The natives were forced into the ship's hull and taken across the ocean to Spain to be sold into slavery. Distrust grew into Tisquantum's heart during his travel across the sea, and he wondered why the Great Spirit would allow him to be so mistreated. After a long journey, they finally arrived in Spain. Tisquantum did not know what his future would hold and wondered if he would ever see home again. Upon landing in Spain, the slave traders sold several natives. But Tisquantum was set free by a group of Spanish friars who disrupted the event before Tisquantum's sale. The friars took him in, and he lived among them. He learned how to speak Spanish and about their Christian faith, about the one true God of the Bible and His Son Jesus. They taught him their self-sustaining lifestyle, planting and harvesting crops. Tisquantum grew to love and trust the monks, and life was good with them. But his desire to return home to his people, his tribe, never left him. He longed for the familiar places, the family and friends from whom he had been so violently taken. He prayed to God that somehow, someday, he would be able to return to his tribe. God heard his prayers. The friars devised a plan to get Tisquantum back to his homeland and to his beloved tribe, It would not be easy, and it would take several years, but their plan was put into action. He made his way to England, where he lived with and worked for an English businessman named John Slaney. Slaney and his Newfoundland company were looking for opportunities to expand trade with the New England natives. Tisquantum had learned how to speak English fluently and would earn his way back to America, working for the company as a translator. Hope sprung up in Tisquantum as he believed he would soon be home with his tribe. He remained in England for a few more years, but Tisquantum's hope never died. He'd been places that few in his tribe could even imagine, and he longed to tell them about all that he'd done and seen. Finally, in 1619, everything was in place. Once more, he sailed across the ocean. This time, his destination was home.
When we come back, Tisquantum's heartbreaking discovery upon return to his home and how God used his life's journey for a greater purpose. Welcome back. Well, after years living in strange lands, Tisquantum was coming home, but his joy at returning to his people soon turned to sadness, and he questioned God's purpose for his life.
With his feet finally back on familiar soil, Tisquantum ran towards his village, excited to be reunited with his loved ones. His heart was crushed by what he discovered. Plague had ravaged his people only months earlier, and everyone had died. Of his tribe, only Tisquantum remained. Confused and alone, he pondered his existence, his purpose. Why had he endured the years of struggle and false hope in strange lands? Why did he make it all the way home, only to find such devastation? Thoughts of death were not far from him. He was accepted into the neighboring Wampanoag tribe, but in his heart, he knew he did not belong. Word came to Tisquantum that a group of European settlers had set up their camp on the very site of his former village. They were English, pilgrims. He spoke their language and knew their ways. He saw how they struggled to survive, how they prayed to Jesus for help, for hope. His heart went out to them, and he longed to help them. With the blessing of the Wampanoag chief, Tisquantum made his presence known. The pilgrims were filled with fear at the sight of him. So far, relations with the native tribes had not been easy, and tensions were high. As Tisquantum neared the entrance of the village, he raised his voice and spoke in perfect English.
My name is Tisquantum, and this is Big Bear. We mean you no harm.
The pilgrims were amazed at the sight and sound of him. They welcomed him in, and he made his home with them. In the spring, Tisquantum taught the pilgrims what he had learned from his own tribe and his time with the friars in Spain, how to plant crops and fertilize seeds. He was their interpreter and helped make peace with the Wampanoag and other tribes in the area. Before long, he was more at home with the settlers than he was anywhere else. He lived with them and in many ways became one of them. In the fall of 1621, the harvest was abundant. The pilgrims were thriving. God had answered their fervent prayers through Tisquantum, and in the process, healed his broken heart. In November of that year, the pilgrim leaders held a great feast, giving thanks to God for providing for their needs. William Bradford, the leader of the pilgrims, asked Tisquantum to invite the Wampanoag tribe to the Thanksgiving celebration. They came and joined the party for 3 days, and there was peace and joy in the region.
Brothers and sisters, we gather today with thankfulness in our hearts. The Lord in His mercy has planted us and established us here. We have seen times of adversity and mourning and scarcity, but now the Lord shows us a time of harvest and plenty. And we are thankful for Squanto, who has joined us in our pilgrimage here to worship God freely. His path has not been easy, but the Lord was with him and sustained him and brought him to this place before us. And He has been an answer to our prayers here, that the Lord would provide for us, provide a way by His mighty hand. And the hand of God is with you and has never forsaken you. The psalmist tells us, "Give thanks unto the Lord, for He is good, and His mercy endures forever." And today, with our friends and our families and our neighbors, we will declare this a great day of thanksgiving, and we will celebrate, and we will praise the Lord for His mercy to us and His presence with us. Amen.
Without Tisquantum's help, the Pilgrims may not have survived those early brutal years. Tisquantum put his faith in the God of the Bible and lived with the Pilgrims until his death. He became known as Squanto, and his legend lives on today in the story of the first Thanksgiving, the Native American man whom God used to answer a desperate prayer from a desperate people.
Thank God for Squanto, or there wouldn't be Thanksgiving. Well, thanks for joining us this week. Until next week, from all of us, goodbye and God bless you.